Hello and welcome to another Iceberg video. Today we continue on our retro ranking series with the worst of NCS in 2021. I found it easier, for some reason, to make themes within NCS lists in comparison to Monster Cat. As the decade has progressed, while there's certainly been quality from well-known talents, some talents or trends felt more random or out of place within the label and often represented its lowlights. Some new ideas have certainly made for some great tracks, but if I had to point to the year where NCS started becoming more inconsistent, I would probably say 2021. Alongside iconic releases such as Phoenix, Royalty, and Rise, there were also a fair bit of releases that made much less sense here. And if the best of 2019 was centered around melodic dubstep, the worst of 2021 is centered around trap. The start of the decade generally felt like a burnout phase for trap music, regardless of where you looked. I would argue it took until 2023, maybe 2024 to get going again. So for those who haven't seen my ranking videos before, this list will have one song per artist and it will be originals only. Let me know of any songs you think I missed, as some songs were close to being here. But with that out of the way, let's talk about the top 10 worst NCS songs of 2021. Number 10. It felt like there were going to be some drum and bass tracks and acts that I can't quite get sold on. Even in retro rankings, it happens almost every year. You have no idea how close Simi was to making my worst list in 2025. Had I not paid attention to the end of the year, Spicy with Cartoon would have made it there. It's a mess with its production and lyricism, and easily one of the worst songs in the Cartoon and Friends album. And seeing his NCS discography heading up to the album, unconvincing is the best way I could describe it. There's not much in the breaks apart from the re-space and the vocals, where the reverb covers the mids and highs of the mix fairly well. But the drops, though, are really undercooked here. The hollowed out lead synth, along with the weak percussion and muddy distortion in the bass, it's been an issue with most of Simi's music. And while the second drop is better with the double time jump up pattern and the phaser for the leads, a lot of atmosphere is still taken away from the break. And that makes the drops even more perplexing overall. Just a bad drum and bass song where it matters most. And elsewhere on NCS, it doesn't look that much different for him. Number 9. Yeah, this was a last minute change, and it made me more confident about this list as a whole and where the anomalies have been. I couldn't leave this off my list in the end. I've gone back and forth on this one because on one hand there are some decent sounds used here, but it comes down to how the full product is executed and how inconsistent it is when hearing it out entirely. The sub bass for the drops is solid, and there are elements within the drops like the pulse leads and arps that could be used well but are just used randomly. The pulse leads in particular are overly short and stuttery, and it leaves behind unnecessary pockets of silence. If you notice, there's reverb for these leads at first until that suddenly cuts off. And then there's a sudden house switch up that makes even less sense. More elements involved, and yet it's even more slapdash on how they're actually used. Plus, that filtered vocal gets really annoying. I mean, it's already been used enough times outside of those drops. The second drop uses some chords as a change from the first drop, but they're short as well and leave behind a lot of empty space. It's the structure of these drops that damages the song's potential. Simply too much trouble with it. Number 8. Now I bet some people will be surprised this song isn't higher. It seems like it's commonly disliked within the community. Drop-wise, there are some elements I can enjoy, but this is a reminder to hear out the whole song, because outside of the drops, it's a completely different story. Let's get the positives out of the way for once. In a year of bad trap drops, I didn't have too many problems with this one. The plugs have some solid sound selection, and it makes sense to utilize that bass line occasionally, to the point where it can work in the midsection too. But while the minimalism works to an extent in the drops, it's fairly low effort elsewhere. Because there's minimalism and then there's being too simple to a point where there isn't much else to offer. The sharp synths in the break are bland and repetitive alongside the claps. And of course, the vocal. I think it's probably the biggest issue with the track for a lot of people. I do remember hearing this vocal sample in another track as well, so having this slowed and pitched down, it just doesn't work at all. At least we have the likes of Invisible and Where'd You Go to look back on instead. Number 7. Another song that seems to be particularly disliked in the community, as far as I know, is Overdosing by Phoenix and Huber. Yeah, it's a bit slow-paced, but the slap bass at least tries to add some groove to it. That, and I think this song is even worse. Even with Phoenix being a solid vocalist, I can't say anything has stood out to me production-wise, and when it tries to, there's something that holds it back. With this song providing a mysterious tone, or at least I think it's intending to, a lot of the instrumentation feels tiring to the point where the vocals stand as the only notably good thing about this. And even that gets messed up in the drop with the distorted vocal sample that gets slapped in for no reason. And speaking of the drop, I mean, the complete lack of energy may be due to that darker tone she tries to go for, but the distortion of the synths makes it sound muffled and blown out. The melody's all over the place as well, so there's a little that makes the drops worth returning to. If the word is truly out, I'm still on a scavenger hunt to find the point of the secret. Number 6. I want to make an argument here that high-pitched vocal chops do not automatically ruin a song. It's a fairly common drop style in melodic dubstep that can be egregious, especially given the main talents that have led that push before. It really comes down to how it's executed. I could point to songs like The Right Time by Youth in Circles, Back to Me by Affinity, Wishing Loud by Angemi, and especially Beautiful and Broken by Fairlane. I would also argue that vocal chops don't have to be whiny in order to be terrible. In one of my first ranking videos, I mentioned that there was a difference between emphatic and generic melodic dubstep, although generic might not be the best word to describe it. It depends on what you're aiming for, as some melodub songs try and go for that grand sweeping punch, while others don't even seek that. This is one of the more generic cases, but for the wrong reasons. I feel like with melodic dubstep in general, there's almost no benefit in trying to be simple. The breaks take a pop route with the guitar, vocal, and drum pattern without much else, and the guitars are a bit too loud in the mix. Not as overpowering though as the filtered pads in the drop. And I'm not too sure what kills the drop more, the random vocal chops or those muddy pads. And again, with the simplicity, there's not much if anything to redeem it. Sure, there are some extra synths near the end, but the execution there is still far from ideal. It did fall back on me a bit because the LFO stutters are kind of cool, and they had a pretty good collaboration with Robbie Rosen later on. I think they eventually learned from this one. They kinda had to. Number 5. And now we enter the gulf of the trap lowlights. Again, 2021 was a down year for the genre as a whole, where the festival trap energy got phased out and it was difficult trying to find an alternative. And for this, we have to combine it with the trend of orchestral elements and drops. I want to say it started becoming a thing because of the popularity of royalty, and while it works there for what it was, it doesn't often work elsewhere. Case in point. Casters and Fortuny and Ironheart's Reconquista might be the only songs where operatic choir elements have clicked in terms of aggression in particular. Very few NCS songs could pull it off, but let's be real, that's far from the main issue here. This song tries to go for a motivational approach, but the flow and lyricism are just too immature to work. With the flow in particular, he hops around too much between different pockets, and it all sounds cringeworthy. And with the drops, you're not Alexander Lewis, buddy. The melody line of the trombone and the ambience with the strings and choir, all of it feels like a cheap and desperate approach to provide any semblance of much needed energy. And there's little intrigue in those elements when there isn't much outside of the percussion that makes it even feel like a proper trap drop. And while we're on the topic of trap being outside its element in the worst way, number 4. In the heavy dubstep scene, there are some big acts that are connected with heavy metal. The likes of Sullivan King, Kaiwachi, and Vasta, for example. Oftentimes that brand of dubstep winds up being tear out or Brittum. And although I don't often go out of my way to listen to their live sets in detail, apart from seeing if they've collaborated with someone like Crowdx yet, that side of metal-infused dubstep makes sense for headbanging. At least, it makes more sense in comparison to this. Dr. Nyman is one of those cases of being a one-off on the NCS label. Nothing else to build off of his discography over here. He did have another collaboration with Micah Martin over on Disciple, and it was also really bad. Over there, it was more Brittum-oriented with some rough sustains and little else to redeem it. This song goes for trap instead and completely wastes Micah's performance. The rock elements don't mesh together with anything else from the production, as the synth of the break feels out of place and poorly mixed, and the drops sound horribly dated. Not only do the leading acid wubs make no sense in reference to the rocktronic style Micah aims for, nothing around it works either. The cheap trap percussion alongside a sliding groan in the bass, that was an especially bad choice. Analyzing this in detail actually pushed it up the list with how their styles completely clash. This just wasn't worth the wait. Number 3. If you paid attention to my best songs of 2019, you probably should have seen this one coming. MIME has done some decent work assisting in tracks as a rapper, but being one of the leading producers here, it's probably one of his worst yet on the label. Push the Gas takes things one step further than Power to epitomize some of the worst of trap rap. From the over-auto-tuned vocals for the LJ to a mostly stagnant instrumental. Maybe it's just me being a festival trap old head, but I feel like for a lot of this genre on the label, either they're not giving the drops any sort of emphasis, or the execution doesn't work. This might be a mix of both with how flimsy the synth sound is. And with the bigger issues being outside the drop, even MIME's own rapping can't do enough to save it. Not with a concept that just doesn't fit here. Not with a brand of trap rap when the genre as a whole is capable of better. Number 2. In my time producing my own music, it has become easier to notice mixing issues and really just nitpick in general. I've personally been a perfectionist when it came to my own stuff, especially as I've learned more. But for a prestigious label, it's rare when a song's mixing is so out of place that it makes you wonder how it got here. I mentioned this particular song when talking about my worst list in 2025. How one factor can hold a song back, but here, it drags it down a new level. 2021 was Koza's last year on the label, and quite possibly his worst. While he's had some half-decent mixes earlier, it's gotten so bad to the point where I wonder if this would have made it here under a different artist. Sometimes that's the conversation with certain songs, that it's only here because of the artist behind it. And no song takes a half-decent concept and butchers the mixing more than this. First off, why does it sound so filtered near the lows of the mix? It takes away from its energy, especially with how the percussion overpowers the song on occasion. And with the synth production, I can't even put my finger on how the sidechain is used, but generally gets dominated in the mix and feels inconsistent with its movements. It doesn't help that the sub bass is so stagnant. The overarching issue is that it doesn't even sound like a full unit. I don't think a lot of others would pick on the mix in particular, but I can't help but call it out when it's such a rough listen for that reason alone. Indeed a paradox in more ways than one. Before I reveal my number 1 spot, I'd like to take a moment to advertise my other channels. Iceberg Gaming is home to all sorts of gaming content, and Iceberg Music is where you'll find my releases and mixes. Also, stay tuned for some upcoming community and collaboration opportunities, and let me know if you'd like to get involved in those too. But with that out of the way, let's talk about number 1. Beyond a song with poor mixing is one with no sense of cohesion. One easy way to wind up as the worst song of the year is to represent the worst of a genre, and to exemplify the trap music burnout at the start of the decade. I'm not sure if the NCS community looks back on this particular song fondly, and I'm not sure why they would. Along with the Numb the Pain mega collab, Lamals has only had one other song here and come through. A half-decent concept with a not-so-great execution. I shouldn't narrow it down to specifics, but I can safely say the absolute worst moment of an NCS song this year was the first drop here. If it's trying to take influence from Boombox Cartel, it does so in the worst way, with a synth that fluctuates so painfully slowly. And on top of that, it sounds like it's in a different key. Really, it feels like a completely different song from everything else. And sure, while the second drop might be a typical switch up, the damage was already done. And it doesn't help matters that I've heard this vocal sample many times before. Of all the options out there, this one is the most directly egregious in its issues. And that's what makes For You by Lamals the worst NCS song of 2021. And that'll wrap up this video. Let me know of your least favorites in the comments below. And if you guys enjoyed, feel free to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And I'll talk to you in the next video.